Today, we'll be tackling and taking a look at debt. Good versus bad debt.
There are two ways to think about good debt and bad debt. In one perspective, it's like, what are you using the debt for? The other is the interest that you have to pay on that debt. There are good interest rates and there are bad interest rates. Why is the debt situation in South Africa so bad? I think there are multiple reasons. One of it is financial literacy, and that a lot of people can't access formal credit because they are just kind of excluded from the system.
Any advice on how to get out of debt?
There are a couple of key practical steps, right? So the first is just
Welcome back to another episode of Frankly Speaking, where we tackle topics around investing and managing your money with a no jargon approach. My name is Kival Miraj, and I'm an operations associate here at Franc, an app that makes investing simple and accessible to everyone. If you want to learn more about what we do, check out the description box below. If you like what you see or hear on today's episode, give us a like, leave us a comment, or tap on the subscribe for future episodes. Today, I've got our CEO and co-founder, Thomas Brennan, with me.
Hi, great to be a part of today's episode. Thanks, Kaval.
Today, we'll be tackling and taking a look at debt. What is debt? Good versus bad debt? Why and when you should avoid debt? And the 3-step plan to get out of debt if you're already in it. Let us know below if you know how much you owe and how much interest you are paying. So let's get right into it. Tom, would you like to take us through what is debt in the first place?
Sure. And obviously, I want to just start off in a personal way, because I think debt is something that most people have experienced in a good way or a bad way. So I think it's important that everybody knows that they're not alone when it comes to kind of dealing with debt. That some people can feel a little bit of shame if they are in a bad situation, and again, just to know that you're not alone. Other people have and are in bad situations. I myself, when I was a student, got into some bad credit card debt, which took me a long time to get out of. And I think talking about those experiences is important, right? And knowing that, again, you're not alone, and we can help you. So, I think the way to think about debt is actually to take a little bit of a step back and be technical about it and think about what is credit. So credit is when you borrow money from a borrower or a lender, or you lend money, and somebody's giving you money. There's an exchange, and many people think about debt as what is left over in terms of what you owe back to that person who's lent you money. So a simple example, somebody is willing to give you 100 Rand. You are in their debt for that 100 Rand. Very often, though, when you do lend money from an institution like a bank, or even from a friend or a family member, there is an expectation, or it's actually in the contract, that you have to pay interest on that loan. So it could range anywhere from, if it's a regulated credit provider, like a bank, for example, there are strict limits to how much interest they can charge. But sometimes if you're borrowing from friends and family, and obviously if you're borrowing from like loan sharks or machinistas, as they call them, there's no limit. And you can have to pay, 300%, 400%, year on year, which I think is obviously a crazy amount, and we can get into, kind of how you separate out good debt from bad debt. But at a basic level, debt is when you borrow money from some body or some institution, and you have to pay interest on that amount that you borrow, and you have to pay that back in a defined period of time. So that is credit, and that is to be in debt.
Yeah, you're right about the university stuff. When I was in university, I had my first credit card. It was like the perception that I have all this money, but in fact that you're actually just borrowing money and you have to pay it back at the end of the day, which people forget about. You mentioned good and bad debt. Could you use some practical examples, maybe in your life per se, of good and bad debt?
Sure. So I think there are two ways to think about good debt and bad debt. In one perspective, it's like, what are you using the debt for, right? There's good reasons, there are good things to do with borrowed money, and there are bad things to do with borrowed money. The other is the interest that you have to pay on that debt. There are good interest rates and there are bad interest rates, right? So let's first look at what you do with the money. Generally, there's a sort of a rule of thumb. You should try avoid debt for consumption. So what that means is, going to a restaurant and consuming a meal based on money that you borrowed is not ideal, right? And that's a simple way to think about it. But obviously, what you purchase can obviously be a lot larger. Like you're buying a TV on credit, buying an appliance or buying anything on that. However, you can buy assets. So, for example, like getting a home loan, you're buying a house, and obviously there's an expectation that the house has some intrinsic value and that it might increase in value over time. That should be viewed different than buying something where either you're going to consume it or the value of what you bought is going to decline. So a car loan, for example, I think is in the middle ground. You can resell a car, but typically you're selling it for less than you bought it for. Cars do depreciate over time. They've got wear and tear, they've got mileage on them. It's very rare that you'll be able to get back, if you sell your car secondhand, a price for what you bought it for. Nevertheless, there still is some exchange of, you can get some money back, right? And so buying a TV, for example, is another example. You're probably never going to get back the price at which you bought it for, but you may get some money back. But definitely buying for consumption, where it's a restaurant or something that, you can't resell, is most definitely considered bad debt. So that gives you some idea in terms of the usage of the debt. They talk about secured loans and unsecured loans. And that sort of, I think, leads us into our next kind of part of that question, which is to judge good debt from the interest that you're paying. Typically, secured loans, so something like a home loan, for example, where it's secured by the actual property that you've bought, tends to be at an interest rate which is 3 times less sometimes than an unsecured loan. So what that means practically is the interest rates that banks will charge are limited by law, and typically they're based on what is called the prime interest rate. A lot of people have heard the prime interest rate, and recently the prime interest rate has gone up. So a lot of first-time homeowners are shocked because their monthly repayments on their home loan have gone up like 40%, and obviously they may not have budgeted for that increase, and now obviously they're in a tight space. However, an unsecured loan, also based on the prime interest rate, can be 3 times higher than a home loan, right? So I think people can and should be aware that unsecured loans have far higher interest rates, and therefore definitely should be considered like, they're bad because it's just more expensive. The cost of capital, the cost of lending is a lot higher. Obviously, and this, I mentioned it earlier, like if you go to a loan shark, they are not regulated and can charge you whatever interest rate that you like. I was recently in kind of the Northern Cape, and their guys have to hand over their bank card. So they're using SASSA grants and are borrowing against that. And obviously those grants are paid onto their card. And the loan shark, the machinista, will take that card and basically pay themselves first, and the interest rate is double of what you charge. So it's 100% per month. So that's like 1,200% per year. And if you compare that to like home loans, where you're probably being charged in the range of, prime plus, 13%, to 15%, on a home loan, compare 15% versus 1,200%. So a way to define bad is any interest rate that is more than 35% is undoubtedly bad. Like you should try and avoid that as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, definitely. You were mentioning loan sharks, and would you say that contributes to why debt is such a problem in South Africa?
It's such a it's a question that I'm passionate about, and it really saddens me. So access to formal credit, so by formal credit I mean it's coming from an institution, is actually not easy in South Africa. There are only 22 million people who have a formal credit profile with the credit bureaus, and obviously there are 60 million people in the country, so that's like a third of the population has access to formal credit. So that means that what is the other, and obviously there are a lot of children in the 60 million. I think there are only about 45 million adults. But it means like, what are the other 50% adults doing for credit? They can't go to the banks because their banks won't serve them. They won't be able to give them credit. So their only option in many instances is either borrowing from friends and family, participating in a stokvel scheme, or borrowing from loan sharks. So it's, the blame is not all with the loan sharks. They are servicing a market need, and because they are operating in an unregulated space, like, unfortunately, they can charge whatever they want. Stokvels, although a lot of people borrow from a stokvel and they are great, very often the stokvel rate is typically about 10% per month. And that's typically easy to calculate, which I think is one of the reasons why stokvels kind of just come down on that. But again, that's 120% per year. That's a high interest rate for any kind of standard loan if one were to just to compare the interest rates. So yeah, it is a frustrating question. Is like, why is the debt situation in South Africa so bad? I think there are multiple reasons. One of it is financial literacy, and that's why we're doing kind of this podcast, is try and educate people around type of debts to avoid. It's also systemic, as mentioned, that a lot of people can't access formal credit because they are just kind of excluded from the system. So yeah, there are multiple factors that can that contribute to people being in bad debt situations.
So you mentioned quite a lot of South Africans are in debt, and for any of our viewers or listeners, one thing to note is that you're not alone. There are many people in debt. Tom, would you have any advice on how to get out of debt for those who are?
So, I think there are a couple of key practical steps, right? So the first is just acknowledge that you're in a bad situation. Don't try to run from it. Definitely don't try to borrow more money to pay off a bad, another debt. Like, you're just compounding the problem. You're never actually getting out of the situation. So the first thing is to actually acknowledge, like, okay, I'm in a hole. I need to get out of this hole. How do I do that? So the first thing I think is really important is, like, why do you want to get out of the hole, right? There's got to be a real, like, powerful motivating force for you as an individual and for your family, maybe, about why you want to get out of debt. And I think that having the goal in mind, having the reason in mind, is going to help you get through the tough times. And the tough times are, you have to budget. You've got to cut back on your expenses. You've got to work harder to maybe earn some more money, and that's just going to be hard. It's going to be hard. The next kind of key practical step, once you've kind of like identified why you want to get out of debt, is to kind of do a little bit of an audit, like a personal audit. So, like, okay, what do I owe? Do you have any credit cards? Do you have any store cards? Have you borrowed from friends and family? From a stokvel, from a loan shark? Do you have car financing? Do you have a home loan? Like, the full suite. To have a very clear understanding of how much you owe, and also how much interest you're being charged for that loan, right? So that should give you a very clear understanding. It's like, okay, my credit card, I'm getting charged probably about, 30% interest on a monthly basis on the amount that I owe. I've got a home loan, which is obviously probably going to be a lot more, but the interest I'm paying is a lot less. I've borrowed some from friends and family. I've got a kind of a loan shark personal loan with a bank, or whatever the case may be. Once you've done that, then it should be quite clear, based on the interest rates and how much you owe, that you can and should go after the loan which is charging you the most interest per month at the highest interest rate. So pay that off first. Like, that's the bad debt. Like, go after the bad debt first, and then just pay. Try and budget as much as you can. Get some extra income. Just make sure you can try to get that off your account. Your personal account. And once you've cleared that, you can see that there's starting to be a little bit of a snowball effect, because all of a sudden you're no longer servicing that debt. You've got a little bit extra in your budget to kind of now reallocate to a different loan. So once you kind of, it's like, just, you identify in your kind of shotgun what loan you want to go first, and then just start shooting them down. That's the practical way. Sometimes you can't get out of that hole, right? It's just too deep, and you don't have extra income coming in, and you can't cut any more expenses because you're down to the bare bones. For those people, there is something called debt counseling, debt review. It's a formal process where you can apply to a debt counselor to help you renegotiate your loans with your credit providers. Obviously, that's only for regulated credit providers. So, you can't be negotiating with a loan shark in this regard, just to be clear. And because it's also a formalized, regulated process, while you are in debt review, which can take anywhere from 6 months to, even 18 months, you can't access any more credit. So it's important for people to know that. So like once you go into this process, it's a funnel. You've got to go in. You will hopefully come out the other side, debt free. But while you're in that process, you can't take on any more debt. So yeah, to know that, if you wanted to sort of buy a house in that time frame, for example, you would not be able to do so. If you wanted to buy a car with car financing, you wouldn't be able to get that car loan while you're in that debt review process. So hopefully sort of those 3 steps, and then the sort of like the escape hatch into debt review is sort of a practical guide for what people can do.
So you mentioned earlier, Tom, that you had your own personal struggles of getting out of debt when you're a bit younger. How did you stay motivated, and how do you go about setting and achieving goals in the whole process of getting out of debt?
I think back to being a student, I had a stipend, which I was getting on a monthly basis. As you say, the credit card kind of was like free money. I was, traveling and spending more than I should have. So when it started really hurting, where I just saw the amount that I owed on the credit card just kept on like increasing. And we haven't touched on this, but it's important that people know, some people know that, when you invest, for example, compound growth is when the interest that you earn month on month is based on the accumulated interest you've earned in previous months. So in that sense, it compounds. But debt works in exactly the same way, but to your disadvantage now. The interest that you're charged on the amount that you owe compounds month on month. So if you actually don't service that debt, you have to pay more and more, right? So once I saw that it was out of control, I wasn't necessarily servicing and repaying that debt appropriately to bring that amount down. It actually was increasing because of the interest rates being charged. It really kind of freaked me out. So yeah, it was a very personal kind of like, I need to get out of this. I'm very uncomfortable in the situation if it's going against me very rapidly. So I took an extra job, obviously, which distracted or took up time, so I wasn't able to focus on my studies, but I needed the money. And when I had that money coming in, it wasn't as if I was able to spend it on nice things. It was just going to pay off this debt. So it wasn't fun. I mean, people would say, come, let's go out for a meal, or let's go out to a restaurant or a bar. Like I had to say no because I couldn't go, or if I did go, I was like ordering glasses of water. But it was a period. It took me about just over a year from my kind of initial like kind of realization that this wasn't a good situation and I need to get out of it. So it was a year of tough times. But I think just staying focused on wanting to get rid of it, not wanting to be hamstrung, not being controlled by somebody else. I mean, a lot of people talk about financial freedom, and it's a very real thing, to be in control of your own personal destiny and not have, somebody can come knocking on your door and say, right, give me your money.
You mentioned different methods in tackling your debt, where you either try to pay off the balance or you pay off the interest. Could you just summarize these two methods again for any users that might have missed that?
So I think once you've got that sort of audit or the sort of inventory of your debt, right? I think it's important to know that like, there's some debt, like hypothetically a car loan or a home loan, like there's no way you could pay that off in any given month, right? You're not going to be able to have enough to pay off that debt. And the interest that you're charged on that, as mentioned, because it's a secured loan, tends to be a lot lower than, say, your credit card, right? So I think a good rule of thumb is just go after where you see the highest interest. So in your audit, if you see an interest rate which is sitting at about 35%, and the way you can find out your interest rate, if you go to you should have a record. The credit provider should have given you a record. If it's a store, if it's a bank, when you opened up that account, you would have been given a piece of paper which says, right, here's the interest rate, right? That's where you should go and find it. And if you look at the statements, very often, you'll be able to see what the interest rate is, charged at. If you just go after the high interest rate, I think that's the easiest rule of thumb. So, if you own to friends and family and you're paying 10% per month, and that's the highest debt, that's the highest interest. It's important though, on this, that you standardize the interest rates to a time frame. So the banks typically work on a year cycle, and loan sharks and other places work on a monthly cycle interest rate. They're 10% per month. It's important that you multiply that by 12 in order to get what the annual interest rate. So you kind of comparing apples and apples, if that makes sense. And then once you've got all your kind of interest rates, just go after what is the highest interest rate and try pay that off as quickly as you can.
So if anyone has taken that three-step approach to try get out of debt, if they're still struggling, I know you mentioned there are professional debt consolidation that you can go through and refinancing and professional assistance. Is there anything else they can try do to help them rid themselves of debt?
Yeah, and I think it basically comes down to having money to service the debt, right? And the only way you can have more money, unfortunately, is either you have to earn more or you have to spend less. Those are the two options. So, it is advisable. Like, I had to take an extra job to try and earn some more money in addition to my kind of student stipend. Think about ways in which you can maybe earn a little bit extra money. Maybe it's working on the weekends. Maybe it's, taking up an after hours job. I mean, it's tough to say. Ask for a promotion. Be assertive if you're already in some form of employment. There's nothing holding you back to try and increase how much you're bringing in. Then obviously it comes to looking at your expenses. Sometimes you may need to make drastic decisions, like hypothetically, you're living in a place where the rent is very high, but you could actually, move into a place where the rent would be less. Like, that's very severe because it's obviously a life change and it's a move. There's simple things like, buying groceries in bulk, so trying to see how you can reduce your other monthly expenses as much as you can. Instead of taking Uber to get to work, see if you can take public transport to get to work. Different ways of being able to reduce your monthly expenses. And then it's important, once you do make those cuts, either you're increasing your income and reducing your expenses, that you don't see that new money in your budget as money to spend. Your focus should be primarily, okay, I'm getting out of debt. This is what I'm doing at the moment. And just start funneling as much money as you can into sort of servicing that and repaying that debt.
I think you've made some very informative and valid points throughout this conversation, Tom. If I had to ask you to summarize a few key takeaways from this episode, what would you say is the most important?
I think at one level, and this is kind of what based on my personal experience, because I had that bad experience with credit card debt, I saw all debt as terrible. I didn't want any debt in my life. And the next time I took out debt was to buy my house where I'm currently sitting, which was like 15 years later. And I missed out on opportunities of doing good things with debt, right? And that's tough to hear, especially if you're in a bad situation with debt. You'd easily want to consider that all debt is bad. It's important to know that there's good debt, like we've discussed, investing in a house or something that you see can actually grow and provide some stability, to your life. I think that's important. But then there's obviously bad debt, right? And yeah, to summarize, know the difference between good debt and bad debt. Identify where you stand, like how much you owe, how much interest you're paying, and then go through a sort of a tough process of getting out of that. Motivating yourself to work harder, to maybe earn some more income, to cut your expenses, and to start, getting rid of bad debt as quickly as you can. And I mean, we haven't really spoken about it, but even on good debt, most home loans, for example, are over a 20-year time frame. But if you're able to pay your home loan off over, say, half of that time, you would likely have saved yourself a hell of a lot of money. Just to give you a sort of a rule of thumb, a home loan means that you're probably paying the bank double the purchase price of your property over a 20-year time frame. So that's just like, that's tough if you think about it, right? So say you're buying a house for 500,000, a million rand. Over a 20-year time frame, you're paying the bank actually 2 million rand. Whereas if you're able to pay off your loan, and the only way you can do that is putting more in, right? So obviously the bank is saying, here's the minimum payment. If you put in more, if you have extra money to put in, and so you're reducing the outstanding amount with those extra top-ups, you can reduce the total amount of money that you're paying for your house. And I think that's important to know. And obviously it comes back to this idea is like, the quicker you can get rid of your debt, the less the cost of that debt is going to be, in total.
And I think you mentioned as well, like you realize how important it was when you were young to pay off the debts that you owed and you took on a second job. But a lot of people, they might have a family, they don't have time to take on a second job. So I just wanted to say that people also look into side hustles. And I know we've had a previous Frankly Speaking episode about side hustles and how one can earn extra income. So if you want to, you can have a listen to that and maybe you can earn some extra money to start paying off your debt. But Tom, it's been lovely speaking to you today, and thank you so much for your time. If you like what you heard or saw today, please give us a like, leave us a comment, or tap on subscribe for more episodes. And I hope today's discussion with Tom was really helpful for you. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Kaval. Great to be talking about something so important.
Thanks.